Hey, I'm Matt, and welcome to Nothing New, where we explore the ancient roots of modern culture. The 6th century BCE was an age of growth and intellectual flourishing for ancient Greece. Greek merchants sailed across the Mediterranean, trading not just goods, but ideas with their neighbors in the Near East. And the Greeks learned a lot from the cultures that surrounded them, adapting not just the alphabet of the Phoenicians to their own language, but also the math and astronomy of Egypt and Babylon. Ancient Greek architecture, sculpture, and philosophy all owed a major debt to the culture of the Fertile Crescent. The so-called Pythagorean theorem was in fact known by the Babylonians over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, and it is said that thinkers from Thales and Pythagoras to Plato and Hippocrates all studied in Egypt. Many ancient philosophers, such as the famous orator Isocrates, considered that philosophy itself was brought over from Egypt. He states that because of the good conditions of Egypt, they discovered not just philosophy, but medicine too. The priests, because they enjoyed such conditions of life, discovered for the body the aid which the medical art affords. Men agree the Egyptians are the healthiest and most long of life among men. And then for the soul, they introduced philosophy's training, a pursuit which has the power not only to establish laws, but also to investigate the nature of the universe. But before we go much further, I think it's important we talk about why these thinkers are even called the Presocratic philosophers. Philosopher A.C. Grayling describes how the Presocratics were given this name not because all of them predated Socrates, some were his contemporaries, but because the scholars recognized a significant difference of interest between them and Socrates. This is that the Presocratics were concerned with questions about the nature and origins of the world, whereas Socrates focused his attention on ethics. Accordingly, the scholars, following Aristotle's name for them, described the Presocratics as physikoi, physicists. While it is not the case that they had nothing to say in regards to ethics or politics, this is a time before philosophy had structured itself into the disciplines we know today. These were philosophers in the original sense of the word, simply lovers of wisdom just beginning to ask the first questions of philosophy. While the Presocratics shared a common rational outlook and were predisposed to similar questions, they were not exactly scientists in the way that we think of science today, since they were still heavily influenced by the culture of myth and religion that surrounded them. Classicist Robin Waterfield points out that the idea that these thinkers collectively brought something new into the world, a scientific or proto-scientific attitude, a reliance on logos, is too simple and broad a picture. It is in fact rather naive to lump all the Presocratics together as if they were somehow identical, although it has been a tendency in the history of philosophy from Aristotle onwards. Nevertheless, it is clear that not all the people standardly classified as Presocratic philosophers fit comfortably into the Aristotelian mold. They range from shamans like Empedocles, through mystics like Pythagoras and prophets like Heraclitus, to metaphysicians such as Parmenides, philosophers such as Anaxagoras, and proto-scientists like the Milesians and Adamus. To describe Empedocles as a shaman or Heraclitus as a prophet is not to say that they could not make valuable contributions towards scientific or philosophical debate, but it is to say that their emphases and experiences are not those of a complete scientist or philosopher. But despite the variety of interests the Presocratics display, there is something common to them all. So what were these commonalities? One of the main features of Presocratic thought that made them distinct was how they almost always tried to find rational explanations for everything in the universe, instead of resorting to mythos and the actions of gods. While they did not rely on pure logic or do scientific experiments that would meet the standards and rigor of today's science, they were certainly involved in a direct investigation of the external world. Their worldview seemed to move out of the mythological and into the mathematical. Many believed that one substance or force, or sometimes duality of substances and forces, could explain the whole universe. This idea, called the arche, was that there is an ultimate underlying element that was fundamental to all the apparently different substances found in the world. This gave rise to related questions of how this one substance became the plurality of objects we see in the universe, and these questions were what primarily interested the Milesian school. As classical scholar W.K.C. Guthrie put it, since the Milesians assumed that the universe had evolved from a single basic substance, their problem was that of the one and the many, i.e., in this case, what was the nature of this one original substance, and how had it become differentiated into the multiplicity which we see today? Different philosophers had different theories about which substance was the foundational element. The different elements they proposed would become the basis for the four classical elements: water, air, fire, and earth. Parmenides of Elea rose above this view literally and figuratively. In his poem On Nature, he ascends to the abode of a goddess, conveyed on the far-fabled path of the divinity in a celestial chariot led by the daughters of the sun. He is toured through the halls of night and shown the two opposing ways of inquiry, the way of true reality and the way of opinion, or mortals. Maybe a bit pretentious, but Parmenides thought it was important to point out what they saw as the underlying reality underneath the appearance of change. According to Parmenides and the followers of the Eleatic school, which he started, named after the town they studied in, change was illusory. Whatever is, and what is not, cannot be. The universe is ungenerated and deathless, whole and uniform, and wholly perfect. Zeno's famous paradoxes like Achilles and the tortoise were not paradoxes at the time, but put forth as proofs for the idea that change and motion is impossible and are in fact illusions. That may seem crazy, but some scholars point to these philosophers as predecessors for modern ideas like the conservation and equivalence of energy and matter, represented by the famous equation E = mc squared. That is, matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed, but merely change forms. As Parmenides says, generation is extinguished and destruction unheard of. We'll see a lot of parallels between early Greek thought and modern science, like the opposing forces of Empedocles, or how the states of matter, gas, liquid, and solid, is reflected in the insight that matter can condense or rarefy into what seems to be different elements, as the Milesians explored. We'll see that just as these thinkers weren't always investigating the same issues, they certainly didn't always agree with each other about the questions they did share. We've just seen one end of the spectrum in Parmenides' extreme monism, where change is illusory, while at the other end, we'll be exploring thinkers like Heraclitus, who thought that change itself was the foundation of all being, which is why he also thought that fire was the first principle of the universe. To him, nothing is a stable, everlasting thing unto themselves, but instead, everything flows and changes and depends on the dynamic interplay with its opposite. Therefore, you cannot even step into the same river twice, for the water is ever flowing and changing. But Heraclitus is still technically a material monist. That is, he believes that all the universe is made of just one physical substance, even if that substance is characterized by change. The pluralists like Anaxagoras and Empedocles believed that this change came from not one substance, but a plurality of elements and forces interacting with each other. There were many novel and creative solutions put forward in their search for the arche, or first principle of all things, including schools of thought from the atomists to the Pythagoreans, a strange math cult who thought even more abstractly that since rational numbers and the ratios between them could explain so much phenomena, such as music and the movement of the heavens, that math itself was the foundation of reality and what truly lay behind how the world appears to us. Whatever the Greeks thought the world was, they had a deep belief that it was a rational whole, which I think is summed up best in this quote by the classical scholar H.D.F. Kiddo. A sense of the wholeness of things is perhaps the most typical feature of the Greek mind. Homer, for all his love of the particular detail and the individual character, yet fixes it firmly into a universal frame. The way in which so many Greeks are several things at once, as Solon is political and economic reformer, man of business, and poet. The way in which the polis itself is not a machine for governing, but something which touches almost the whole of life. The modern mind divides, specializes, thinks in categories. The Greek instinct was the opposite, to take the widest view, to see things as an organic whole. So that's our brief overview of the Presocratic philosophers, As you can see, the 6th and 5th centuries were a lively time for Greek intellectual life. We obviously couldn't cover everyone in as much detail as we'd like, but there's no need to worry, because all of these philosophers will be getting their own individual videos in the near future, starting next week with Thales, the only philosopher to earn a spot as one of the 7 sages of Greece. I hope you're excited, and I'll see you then.